gentlemen, honorable guests, we're about to start our session about the public-private partnership for public infrastructure development. And to moderate this session, I would like to introduce Mr. Kai Hammerik from Sweden, who's president of KA Foreign Investment Corporation. Mr. Kay, we can start.
Thank you. Please take your seats. Please take your seats. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and honored members of this panel, I wish you all very much welcome to this panel, to this session regarding PPPs, public-private partnerships. Yesterday, I went into a session where they also talked about 3 PPPs, but that was patriotism, protectionism, and populism. But that is not the contents of our session today. It is public-private partnerships. And together with the panelists, we have convened to try to manage this panel in the following way. We have got 3 parts, so to say. First of all, the panelists will have a short introductory remark where they will elaborate a little upon their own experiences and perspectives regarding PPPs. Thereafter, we will have a debate where we will address some of the challenges and some of the issues regarding PPPs. And after that, and thirdly, we will open up for questions from the auditorium. So once again, I wish you very much welcome. And I think we could start from my right and go from right to left, if you are in agreement with that. So I first will give the word to Mr. Salimu Abdullah, who is the chairman of Vodacom, which is a Mozambican private telecom company. Please, Mr. Salimu, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. So my understanding on PPPs, the PPPs for me refers to infrastructure and project to be developed between a public and private partner with a large volume of investments, sunk costs, whose structure of financing construction, operation and maintenance is ensured by the private sector with eventual returns to the government. This partnership should normally provide for gains for both sides in duly calculated risks, in my view.
Thank you so much. And then I would like to give the floor to Mr. Sheremin Sergey, who is Minister and Head of Department for Foreign Economic Activity and International Relations for the Moscow City Government. Please, Mr. Sergey.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies. For Moscow government, it's really a challenging process to be in PPP projects because the country itself didn't have great experience in this field. And only last 5-6 years, we managed to be very active in promoting PPP projects in Moscow and in Moscow agglomeration, because the city itself, it represents also the subject of the federal government. So we are quite independent, and we even promote legislation on the federal level and some changes in the federal legislation that facilitates to the companies and to private entrepreneurs to be the partners for Moscow. if you look at the spheres, you'll find that within just 5 years, we managed to sign at least roughly $15 billion contracts in PPP projects, and the variety of spheres was from public transport, toll pay roads, clinics, children gardens, schools, even parks. And we are trying to invent not only, let's say, the classical types of PPP, but also the new types of contract like offset deals with the providers of services or those who are delivering their products to Moscow government. It's also concession-based projects like a life cycle contract for the complicated equipment, for rolling stock, for subway, buses for municipal needs. And we think that nowadays PPP starts to be more and more the main booster for the development of the city, because Moscow City is a very promising economy according to all the international reviews, and we are stably upgrading in most important research and ratings, ratings from doing business up to ratings of WeGo, PISA, foreign direct investment magazine rating, and others. Thus, we try to create much more stable conditions and much more friendly environment in the field of economics, trying to attract companies and banks and investors to a lot of PPP projects. And as soon as we are improving basic infrastructure and we are investing ourselves at least 12, 15 billion of dollars every year into the transport, into road construction, into building new clinics and the other spheres, we think that the city like this cannot exist without the fresh inflow of capital from private individuals. So we believe that within the coming decades, PPP will be one of the main boosters for Moscow economy.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sergey. And now I want to give the floor to Professor Dr. Bambang, who is the Minister of National Development and Planning in Indonesia. Please.
Thank you very much. Very good afternoon to all of you. For Indonesia, PPP for public infrastructure development is not an option. Actually, it is a must. Why it is a must? Because every time we are talking about our economic competitiveness, Indonesia never gets the high ranking. And one of the reasons is because the lack of public infrastructure. So to accelerate infrastructure development, we have to do something. But our budget has the limitation. Our budget can only cover 41% of the 5 years plan of infrastructure development. So we need to find other sources. We have state-owned enterprise, but they can only contribute up to 22%. So we still have 37% left, and that has to be filled by private sector. Private sector can do two business models in Indonesia in terms of public infrastructure. They can do it through PPP, which is our topic this afternoon, and they can do it, using B2B mechanism. But let us focus on this PPP. In our system in Indonesia, we have two types of PPP. One is unsolicited, in which the idea or initiative comes from potential investors, and then they have to do feasibility study, and they have to participate in the right to match bidding process. The other way, of course, the solicited process, in which you just follow the regular open bidding process. In terms of the payment system in our PPP model, we have two types of payment system. One is through cost recovery, like tariff or user charge. In this case, toll road will fall into this category. The other one would be availability payment. This usually relates to social infrastructure or any type of infrastructure that doesn't have the cost recovery factor. So for example, preservation of the arterial road in the city or between cities will fall into this category. And so far, in our experience in PPP, we already have 12 PPP projects under construction. 7 of them toll road, 1 water supply, 1 power plant project, and 3 national fiber optic system. And the total of those projects is around 10 billion US dollar. Aside from that, we also have 4.2 billion potential PPP project under transaction and 4.8 billion US dollar PPP projects under planning and preparation states. So it's clear we have moved quite firmly in terms of PPP, and I would like to repeat what I just said in the beginning. For us, PPP is a must rather than option. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Bang. And now, please, the floor is yours, Mr. Manuel Carri, founding partner and CEO of the Transport Infrastructure Investment Company from Portugal. Please.
Thank you very much, Kay, and good afternoon to all the panel members and the audience. Well, in fact, I come from a company that invests in PPPs, and I'm also a former banker. So in a sense, a banker investing in PPPs for so long, it's an incarnation of the devil, because this is a combination of 2 things which have been extremely unpopular in the recent years in Europe. Well, PPPs have a very bad reputation for the European countries, and a bad reputation that is somehow justifiable. It's true that a lot of projects didn't work well. It's true that most of the projects did work well. And coming from Portugal, which is a very good example of a good application of the PPP model and a bad application of the PPP model, I think I'm capable of giving you my insights of what should be done and what should not be done. So I would say that the most important thing that we have to learn from the model is that the PPP is not a model to finance deals. It's a model to establish a partnership between the public and the private sector, which means that the first criteria to select PPP is before deciding the model. It's basically the criteria to select the deals itself and the infrastructure itself. You can only build something that you really need. You cannot build something because you don't have money. You need to build it because you need it. Of course, if you have a good reason to establish a partnership with the private sector, it's a clear message that you should not do it because you don't have the money. You should do it because of other criteria. And in fact, a PPP the partnership between the public and the private sector is the ideal way of getting an infrastructure delivered on time and on budget, and therefore bringing a lot of value to the private sector, but also a lot of value to the public sector. And most of all, we need to recognize that a PPP is not a free lunch for the public sector, so eventually someone has to pay for the investment that was done by the private sector, but it's not also a free lunch for the private sector. The private sector has to deliver, has to comply with the rules, has to comply with the quality issues of a PPP, and therefore, if things don't comply with those basic criteria, then for the private sector, a PPP will not be a good deal.
Thank you so much, Manuel. And last but not least, I give the floor to Mr. Pedro Neves, who is leader of the UN Task Force for PPPs, and he's from Portugal. Please, Pedro.
Hello, everyone. I started PPPs in Angola. This was back in the 80s. And the big challenge was to create an oil city to deliver oil in Angola. At that time, the Angolan government did not have the means to develop the roads, the port, the power plant, the housing for the oil companies, and did not want to give the whole thing to the foreign oil companies. I was working with Bouygues, and basically what we did at that time was to make a joint venture, a PPP, between the Sonangol, the Angolan government, and a private sector. This private city, this oil city, still exists today. Since then, I've been doing more than 100 PPPs, more than 60 countries around the world, and today I work mainly with the United Nations. And with the United Nations, and since 2015, when we implemented the SDGs, what I was asked was, how can we put together SDGs and PPPs? Actually, the answer is very simple. United Nations considers that to do the first 16 goals, we need to invest $2.5 trillion per year. And because 2.5 trillion do not exist on public funds, it is asked for the private sector to participate. And so Goal 17 is about inviting, it's a formal invitation from the United Nations for the private sector to team up with the public sector and to deliver the SDGs. Having said this, what is very important is to understand that behind the 17 goals, we are really talking about sustainable development, and sustainable development will be about people, planet, and prosperity. And so what is really the main key that we are looking for is to ask the governments and the private sector. To the private sector, we ask to have a people and the planet agenda. If we do not have a people and planet agenda, if we do not have private partners with people and planet agenda, it doesn't work. And if we do not have public sector that have a profit agenda, it doesn't work either, because the private sector will not invest. We have been now creating, since 2 years, a compendium of case studies. We're looking for real stories. We now have 60 case studies. This year we'll present 40 more, and I would like to invite you to contact me so that we could have eventually your story being presented in Geneva in May 7 to 9. Basically, what are we looking for? Again, impact investing, PPPs, SDGs. What are the examples of the projects that we have? One very good project is a hydropower plant in Tajikistan. It's an unsolicited proposal. It started with the Aga Khan Foundation. We then added IFC, and we are now going to the second phase and the expansion of the hydropower plant. Another example is Haiti. Haiti, at a certain moment, was importing bananas. With the government of Haiti providing the land, the farmers from Haiti making the development and the exploitation of agricultural projects and agricultural funds, today Haiti is exporting bananas. These are the type of projects that we are looking for and that we believe are the way to have PPPs being a window to promote FDI and at the same time to implement and achieve the SDGs.
Thank you so much, Pedro. And I thank the panelists so much for your introductory remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you realize that we have got a very strong panel with 2 representatives from government, 2 representatives from business, and 1 from the United Nations, an international organization. So we have really got a very broad representation here in the panel. What I now would like to do, that is to raise some issues so that we can have, as I said before, a discussion within the panel and then afterwards with you regarding, for example, some of the advantages and disadvantages with PPPs. As we know, the PP concept was launched in the late 80s, beginning 90s, mainly in Europe, starting up in the UK and then spreading through international organizations, spreading through the OECD and to other international organizations. And over the years, we have seen many success stories within PPPs, but we have also seen many failures. And we have seen that the PPP concept probably works better within certain sectors. Anyway, that is the record. For example, within infrastructure, and perhaps less well within other sectors, as for example, hospitals, education, and so on. Then there's also some criticism regarding PPPs. They become too expensive, more expensive than if the government does an efficient procurement itself. So there's much to be discussed as regards the advantages and disadvantages regarding PPPs. And I think that we should look at both sides, so to say, the positive side and the negative side, in order to learn lessons, how to strengthen, how to learn from mistakes in the past, and how to strengthen the PPP concept. And what we have seen lately, I mean, Emmanuel touched upon it, but we have seen some real failures here in Europe. In my country, in Sweden, we are living with a big failure for the moment being regarding a hospital. We have seen it in the UK, we have seen failures in Spain, and so on. We have seen examples where industry actually outsmarts governments so that it becomes a very good business for private industry and less good for the governments. And how can we learn here in order to balance things so that you don't have a super winner and a super loser, but you get, I mean, for a deal to be good, you always have to have two winners, so to say, or two who are satisfied. So that is some of the issues regarding the pros and cons regarding PPPs. So I would like to give the panel the floor now, and we could start by discussing, as you see it, some of the advantages and disadvantages with the PPPs and what we must be aware of so that we can strengthen the PPP concept. Then later on we can discuss some of the issues relating to financing and also lessons to be drawn. Please, should we start with some, as you see it, advantages and disadvantages? And now I don't direct the floor to some specific, or you just wave and then you fight for the floor. So first I give it to Manuel and then to you, Mr. Bandmang.
Okay, so I think you've touched upon a couple of points which are quite clear and reflect, in a sense, the plus and minus of the PPP model. I would just highlight one or two things, because I mean, it's quite clear that under equal circumstances, so if you can procure through normal procurement functions at exactly the same price, if you can operate as efficiently with the private sector as you can with the public sector, obviously a PPP is more expensive because public money is less expensive than private money. So this is a no-brainer. The main point here is that, first of all, the procurement process is much more efficient if it's well done on a PPP scheme than it is if it's done on a public procurement process. And in most of the cases, because of the driver that the private sector has, private sector is more efficient on operating the assets than public sector. So all in all, the PPP model might bring value to the whole process under these assumptions. Of course, another comment I would like to make is a bit coming back to what I said in the beginning. If you don't need the infrastructure, then it won't work. I mean, if you don't need it, you should not do it. And if there's a certain government that wants to build a road, which is, I mean, looks good in their CV, but the people don't need it, then it won't work. It will be a failure. So that's the first thing that I think it's quite clear that people need to understand. You should not build infrastructure that you don't need. You should only build things that you need. It looks very basic and la police statement, but believe me, in most of the cases, the reason why things fail is because people try to procure and to get things that they don't really need, and that it's not popular in the end.
Thank you. Please, Mr. Bambang.
Yeah. I think many people will question why Indonesia goes to PPP way. Again, Indonesia is not an advanced economy. We are still emerging market. We are still developing country. But as I mentioned in my introductory remark, our budget is so limited. I mean, basically, in the technical term, our fiscal space is almost none. I mean, it's already tied to, mandatory spending. But at the other side, we need to accelerate the infrastructure development. So I agree with what Manuel just mentioned. When we define which projects that will be done under PPP schemes that will involve private sector, we have to be sure that the project is very much needed. So once the project is completed, then it will improve the productivity of the economy and it will give the profitability for the private sector. That's the reason why the PPP development in Indonesia, as an example, I think took quite a long time. We started the idea of PPP in the mid-2000, 2005, 2006. But nothing happened. And then the first PPP project that finally executed in Indonesia actually happened in 2016. So we have 10 years until the first real PPP project. Why we need 10 years? Simply because we want to learn from the failure, and of course we want to copy the success. That's the reason when we trying to develop the PPP schemes, we first build the institution to do the guarantee, the institution to provide financing for infrastructure, and then we trying to get the reliable partners. Of course, we got the support from multilateral development bank like the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, but more importantly, we need to learn directly from the countries that have some success with PPP. At least in our experience, we found that 2 countries, Canada and Australia, have done well with their PPP. So that's why both countries gave some kind of technical support to our government to set up our PPP model. And finally, when everything is on the table, then we start to offer a project, at that time 2,000 megawatts power plant to be offered with the PPP schemes. And we have very good response because the bidders coming from Japan, China, Korea, and some European countries. And finally, a Japanese company win. And now they are constructing the 2,000 megawatts, which is the first PPP project in Indonesia. So in general, of course, we are very much aware of the possibility of PPP failure, but we need to learn from that. And I fully agree with Manuel just mentioned. We have to make prioritize in terms of the projects. And fortunately, I'm now, as a Minister of National Development Planning, I'm responsible to make the list of the projects that is really needed by the country, by the economy, and this project will be feasible to be operated or constructed using PPP scheme.
Thank you, Mr. Bambang. If you allow me, I will ask you a question, being the devil's advocate, but I'll wait a little. I'll come back to you. I'll first address myself to the right here and ask you gentlemen where you see the advantages and disadvantages and what you have learned from successes and failures.
Thank you. No doubt that the PPP is the way, especially in Africa, most of undeveloped countries, which I'm as the president of the Business Confederation of the all Portuguese-speaking country. We have 6 countries in Africa, 1 in Asia, 1 in South America, and 1 in Portugal. And most of the government try, for lack of the budget and know-how, to bring a partnership, public and private partnership. But for sure, sometimes it's successful, sometimes it's not successful. If the way of due diligence, with the transparent way to choose the competence private partner, and if it's lack of regulators could be a problem. So in my view, advantage and disadvantage, I think it's easy to check advantage when it is successful, and it is easy to check the disadvantage when a poor performance of PPP. But basically, for the government, is advantage due the possibility to reach objectives that could be impossible due to the budget and know-how limitation, as I mentioned. For private investor, financially will be an advantage due to the possibility to reach positive return of the investment and increase their knowledge. Learning of different know-how is another advantage for both sides. Disadvantage, in my view, come when the PPPs shows that is not concerned with social objectives and goals, and when its returns are not positive for the country and for the investor. In Africa, cultural problems resulted from different spirits, and welfare of work is also a real situation between private investor and government, especially in terms of flexibility.
Thank you. Mr. Sergei?
Thank you. I think that we have great advantages up to now implementing PPP projects in Moscow. Even we do not have great experience, just 5 years from the first big project signed. And for us, it's why it's challenging. And I think that challenging is because Moscow city government has a very stable budget, very healthy economy. We nearly have zero public debt. And some of my colleagues sometimes ask, what for we are going to attract private money for boosting Moscow economy or fulfilling some projects in the city. Even the infrastructure development, we have quite enough funds for that. Roads, subway, electricity, water consumption, purification, cleaning the city, and others. But the mayor's position nowadays is that PPP projects give you the flexibility to allocate funds for much more important needs at the city. And then, for example, if we are going to build new highways from the center of the city, and nowadays Moscow is in a very active phase of renovation, it's better maybe to allocate the project on the basis of the concession, 40-year concession to the private company. And we have the first project, more than $1 billion, that is a toll-pay road from the financial center of Moscow to the suburb. And this is just the first example of, let's say, investment into the infrastructure on the long-term basis. Why we do not have too much PPP projects yet? Because the problem is that we have quite high volatility of the national currency first, and we have a lack of long-term financing. That's why only pension funds or insurance companies or some banks can afford big allocations of the finances into PPP projects like toll-pay roads, for example. And if you look at the possibility to enlarge and activate competitiveness in the city, for example, if we take healthcare, because healthcare is under the umbrella of Moscow government mostly, and we are managing a lot of hospitals and clinics. We tried to launch first PPP project as a concession for one of the biggest clinic in Moscow 2 years ago. On the first stage, it was very successful. Now, as I heard from the owners of the project, that it's not really flourishing. And it shows that there could be also some not some uncertainty in this area because they cannot provide the same maybe quality of the services, even the private company, but the high quality state healthcare is much more popular nowadays in Moscow than even the private one. Moscow government also has a very good advantage in providing the access of entrepreneurs to the real estate that Moscow government owns. We are one of the biggest owners of real estates in the city, and we would like to insert this capital into the economy, but sometimes it was not affordable. And for example, when we had a lack of children gardens, the Moscow mayor decides to provide some buildings for $1 to those who are going to organize children gardens for the local communities. And the project itself was so successful that we managed to give to private entrepreneurs dozens of buildings like this, and not only children gardens, but also schools. So it shows that sometimes, especially in such public areas, we are quite successful, but in some cases we have disadvantages.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I would like to open the floor to you, but before doing that, I would like to raise one question. And I forget my devil's advocate question because that would just take time. So, so we continue. And that is that, let me give you one example from that I know, and it has surely happened in other countries. As I indicated before, we have got a very, very big hospital project going on in Sweden, where private industry has done a terrific business on that, and government a very bad deal. So my question is to you, if you could answer that very shortly so that we can give the audience the questions. How do we, for the future, prepare ourselves so that we get PPP deals between more or less equal partners, so that we get good PPPs, not PPPs becoming too expensive for government, and where one is outsmarting the others because of those competencies and capabilities existing on one side but not on the other. Please.
Okay, just before going to that point, for the advantage point and for the developing countries, I think there's one very important point, and I just did this, and I would challenge everyone to do it. If we go around the booth here, and we ask for the PPP projects, the DFI projects that can be done in PPPs. For instance, when we go to, when we see the Indonesia booth, we have a pipeline of projects. The fact that you have a pipeline of projects, this means that you have an investment plan for PPPs. This means that you have a development policy for PPPs, and this helps a lot. And I would say, now going to your point, and this would be the first point. Let me just go to the second point. And the second point would be, we always talk on PPPs about value for money. It's time now that we start talking about value for people. And this, I would say, when we start talking about value for people, when we are discussing PPPs, we will be entering into a much deeper type of analysis of the partnerships and the partners that we have. And when we understand, PPP is like getting married. And if we discuss too much, we'll have a divorce. And divorces cost a lot of money on PPPs. And so the main point is to make sure that we are getting married with the right partner. And I would say this is the main point. And this means what? This means that because you're entering into a long-term relationship, if you know, and this is something that you can feel from the moment you start analyzing your partner, that he is too greedy, that he wants to outsmart you, on either way, that it will not work. And it will be very important to be very strong and to say this partnership will not work. The cost of divorce will be enormous, and therefore we should stop.
Thank you. Some other comments to the question how to get a balanced negotiation, because that is what it is about, between government and private industry regarding PPPs. Please, Manuel.
If I may, I think the secret for a balanced discussion or a balance of powers between the public and the private sector is preparation. And preparation from the private sector, but also from the public sector. That's a key element to make sure that the projects are sustainable and that the negotiation is done in a balanced way. At the same time, the second key the second buzzword is appropriate follow-up. And the private sector obviously has a follow-up of the investments, which is completely different from the public sector. Public sector lives depending on the election cycle. So every 4 years or every 8 years, the government changes, the people change, and therefore the follow-up is in most of the cases quite poor. And that's something that you really need to pay attention to. In order to have a balance of powers between public and private sector, you really need to prepare quite well the deals initially, but you also need to follow them up in a very, very good way. Otherwise, in 10 years' time, the private sector will know everything about the deal. On the public sector, it will be the third guy in front of us, and he will know nothing about what is going on.
Dear members of the panel, thank you so much. Shall we open up for questions from the auditorium? And we have got 10 minutes for questions now. And may I please ask you to, when you raise your questions, to stand up, to introduce yourself, and to tell us whom you would like to answer your question. Please. Please. Micro. No, she's coming here, the lady.
It was such a wonderful experience to listen to the panel. And I'm the chairman of Amity University across the globe. It's in 11 countries with 150,000 students. And I've been deeply involved in public policy initiatives, including PPP. So instead of asking a question, I have a very quick comment to make.
No, please, a question. Questions.
Question is to make PPP successful. There are three fundamental requirements that we have. One is that we have to, public policy must incentivize investment in private sector. Secondly, we have to have a very clear concept of both transaction advisory and also KPIs to make sure that we make the right choice of selection and also have a mechanism to evaluate the performance. So therefore, in most governments have two very important factors. One, they have social sectors and political mandates to achieve those social sectors. And because of public bureaucracy, we cannot achieve them on time, even if you want to make investment. So financing, provision, and regulation are three factors where a private sector comes in provision. Sometimes they even come for financing, provided the government has a policy that profit is a must, profiteering is not. So coming to this very important factor, the last point I'd like to make is that the two very important issues. One is transaction advisory in making a choice of the partner, and second, KPIs to make sure that key performance indicators are incorporated in the deal so that you know exactly what has happened in Karolinska or anywhere else. I do not know whether it's in which part of Sweden it is. It should not happen.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'll be able to share a lot of issues on this issue once we break.
Thank you so much for your intervention. Have you got some questions, please, in the auditorium? Yes, please.
One thing that's central to the PPPs is risk.
Could you please introduce yourself?
My name is Mario. I'm from South America, and we're here with the prefect of a province with a project for PPP. One of the most important things in PPPs, and I have not heard, is risk allocation. That's fundamental. That's how we balance out between public and private sector. But there's also a very important factor, that's what I would like to question, is about institutionality. Basically, PPP units all over the world. That's a big factor too. So I would like to hear from you on that.
Whom would you like to address your question?
Pedro and Manuel, I think they're very important on that factor, especially Pedro.
Especially Pedro, please.
Thank you. A friend of mine says that PPP is like having a Ferrari. You know, and when you have a Ferrari, you can go very fast, you can go very far, but you better know how to drive, you know. And this is one point. This means that risk allocation and risk analysis is indeed very important. What is also very important is to understand that the life of the marriage changes during the life cycle. And therefore, it's very important, in my opinion, to keep the balance, to keep the happiness of the partnership, that people understand that risk allocation may need to change throughout the life cycle of the project. Otherwise, it will be imbalanced. And this is very important, again, especially for developing countries and for countries that are starting to have PPPs. Because when the PPP starts, investors are afraid, the government is afraid, and people will have a tendency of over-evaluating risk and therefore asking a premium for risk. The second time, the third time, a similar project will be developed, risk will decrease, and therefore the conditions for developing will decrease as well. Most important, institutionality, I would say leadership, vision. And this is what we are now looking for at the UN. Basically, what we are now asking is, where is this city going to be in 2030? Where is this country going to be in the 2030? And up to which point can you use the SDGs as a roadmap to plan where you are? This basically gives a narrative for the PPP project to position itself, to present the country, to present the city, and basically to enable equity, mezzanine, debt providers to understand with whom are these people and this project talking about.
Thank you, Pedro.
May
There was a question here.
May I just complete
please.
the answer of Pedro and getting back to the image of the Ferrari? And it's okay, a Ferrari is a good animal, it's nice to have, it's a bit expensive, difficult to drive, but the worst thing that can happen to you is that if you cannot afford the fuel for the Ferrari, because then you've paid for it, you know how to drive it, you'd love to drive it, but it's always stopped. So it's one of the key issues is to understand that there is the need for the fuel.
Thank you. There was a question here from a gentleman.
Yes, good afternoon. Álvaro Silva Santisteban from the Ministry of Foreign Trade and Tourism of Peru. And my question is to the gentleman from Russia or Moscow, maybe as well from the person from Portugal. And this is in relation, not on the risk that I was speaking before, but more on the perspective of attraction of capital for the PPPs. Has mega events like the World Cup helped you attract greater perspectives into the PPPs, like if it's done in Russia? And if it has, what has been the difference between before and after? And the reason why I'm relating it to Portugal is because of the Euro Cup that Portugal also hosted a couple of years ago. Did that help you as well to bring more PPPs into the market? Thank you.
Speaking about the World Cup that is coming in June, I think that we faced a very great challenge to improve the sport infrastructure, and we managed to structure some deals like PPP projects when, for example, with Italy, we structured the deal for reconstruction of one of the biggest stadiums that will be used for the games. And it was not only reconstruction of the stadium itself made by Italian company with the support of Italian export agency, but it was also the partnership with one of the biggest Russian banks and partnership with the government of Moscow. And we provided the space and the land for reconstruction, and one of the part of PPP was construction of the hotel complexes, business center, apartments, trade center, conventional center, and reconstruction of the park itself that is situated not far from the center of the city. So it was a very complicated mixed deal, but it was a little bit linked with the coming World Soccer Cup. And it seems to me that if you look at the other cases when we invested into the infrastructure, for sure World Soccer Cup was one of the locomotive for making some new PPP projects, and especially in the renovation of the old-fashioned industrial zones when we built in these places new sport facilities.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now running out of time, and we have just time for 2 questions, and I take those 2 questions who asked for it first. A gentleman over there and the lady here.
Hello.
So the gentleman...
May I ask a question?
I think that the gentleman over there
No,
way before you. He
Okay.
way before you.
No,
okay?
I've had the mic before the very first question.
I see, okay. But then,
Yes.
if we make it short, we will take your question
mine
too.
is short.
Yeah,
Very
but
short.
just wait. We start over there now. Please.
Well, if it doesn't have a mic, may I ask?
Yeah.
Quick. Okay.
Okay.
All right, thank you. I think this is helpful, but given that the theme of this conference
No,
is about...
introduce yourself, please.
Oh, sorry. Alid Kamara. I work as an advisor to government ministries of finance and to investment promotion agencies on attracting investment. So I think what we've heard is helpful, but given that this is focused on foreign investment, I wonder whether we can talk a little bit more about PPPs that have foreign content and the challenges of managing those types of PPPs. Because I think right now we've not been very focused. So I wonder whether the gentleman from Indonesia, since you said your PPP had a Japanese investor, I think it is, how did you manage some issues of political risk, issues of currency transfer, issues that are important to the foreign investor when they get involved in a PPP?
Yeah, basically we treat them like other FDI. You know, so when we have the request for proposal for this 2,000 megawatts project, we invite, you know, participation from all over the world. Any companies, any private sector from all over the world is welcome to join the bidding. And I think we have participants from Japan, China, and others. And finally they win. Of course, there might be some issues, but because we already prepare the structure for our PPP, those problems can be solved. Number one, the issue of government guarantee. In the past, usually when a Japanese company doing FDI in infrastructure in Indonesia, they will right away asking for government guarantee. Of course, with PPP, we cannot give the government guarantee like in the past. So we provide the Indonesia Infrastructure Guarantee Fund that basically give the guarantee for political risk. So at least from political risk point of view, they are okay. So whenever, you know, in Indonesia there will be a new regime coming, new government coming, their situation will be safe. And then political issue, there is no political issue because we did that through open international bidding. So everything is transparent, everything is clear. They are clearly the winner. They have very good experience in power plant. They have presence in Indonesia before, so nobody questioned why these Japanese companies win. In fact, to my surprise, at that time when I got the shortlist 2 Japanese companies and 2 Chinese companies, at that time, I thought the Chinese companies will win because usually Chinese can offer the lower price. But then, after the selection committee doing their effort, the winner is the Japanese companies. And they have the strong JBIC behind that to give the financing. And of course, at that time, there was another issue of land acquisition, but it's our problem in Indonesia. Government can solve the problem. And finally, they did the financial close, and now they are constructing. So this is the way to handle the foreign sector participation. And in fact, the idea of PPP is to invite more FDI from different countries to our infrastructure development in our own country. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have you got the question? No, I'm sorry, we don't have time more. Have you got the micro now? Short question from there, and then from the lady here, and then we have to close.
Peter Owen from Andos Holdings. Our focus is on direct and co-investments in the family office and private investment space. My question is for our guest from Moscow and Indonesia regarding...
Now you have to choose one because we don't have the time for two.
Okay, that's fine. My question is basically, how are you looking to garner more private investment for the sub 100 million projects where you would have private and family investors that may want to invest in those space and be valuable in seeding such projects? Thank you.
Who wants to take it? You want to take it? No, you want to take it?
Sorry, what is the question?
Can you repeat the finish of your question?
Yeah, basically for private and family investors in projects that are say 100 million or sub 100 million, what mechanisms do you have in place to be an interface for them to participate maybe in investments in your country?
Okay, what is it have you got for family offices?
For? Sorry?
For that was a question. Yes. How can family offices participate in PPPs?
Yeah. Again, this PPP, as I mentioned in my previous response, was open for everybody. And of course, you have to have the track record in the certain area that will be done under PPP. And more importantly, you have to have reliable financial source, either a bank or financial institution or maybe some kind of export credit agency, things like that. They have to be part of your bidding process when you try to get a project in PPP. But again, there is no restriction, but basically everybody can participate because we open not only for, in our system, we have private sector and we also have so-called cooperatives. So some kind of business entity that's not directly a private sector, but more on the, the synergy or collaboration among peoples with similar goal or similar purpose.
Very good, thank you so much. And now the last question for, no, I'm sorry lady, no, we don't have the time. We have to finish, but the lady here, please a micro for this lady. And that is the last question. Haifa, you get some exercise now.
Thank you very much, Honorable Chair and the members of the panel. My name is Rebecca Kadaga. I'm the Speaker of the National Assembly of Uganda. Now, I heard from the mayor of Moscow that the PPP allows him to use some funds from his budget for other things, and then the PPP for other things. But from the perspective of the developing countries, by the time we go for a PPP, it means we don't have money in the national budget. So we are not in a very strong position to negotiate. So I wanted to ask Pietro, this value for people is really, really important now because of the SDGs. So I want you to help us. How can we inbuild that test of value for people in those negotiations from our weak position? Thank you.
Thank you.
Please, Pedro, you take care of that. Pedro.
Okay. Thank you. One of the things that is now being launched, namely by OECD, is the blended finance. They've just published it. And the idea behind the blended finance is that we can mix grant with soft loans and then build it up. I would say the most important thing is to start to have a pilot so that we can show the investment committee that there is a business behind it. We can further this conversation. I'm very much interested on projects in Uganda, but I would say what we now need to do is to develop the blended finance where we can start using grants, where we can start use DFIs, multilateral DFIs, bilateral DFIs, and then start having with private equity, and then go to soft loans and so on. What is very important, something else that was said a while ago, is about political risk and mitigating political risk. And mitigating political risk, I would say MIGA on one hand helps a lot, and then we also have political risk insurance. And this is also critical, so that when we wrap up the project and when we present the project to investors, we are taking whatever risk away. And therefore, again, investors are much readier to participate and assist on financial close.
Thank you, Pedro. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a big hand to the members of the panel.